Thanks, Anthony. That's a really sad case, but we're going to be covering it here on the network. As soon as we have a live feed in that courtroom, we'll make sure to go to it. So even though we are covering 3 big cases here on the network, we want to touch upon our main one, the one that we've been focusing on more last week, and we're going to continue today. It's the Shaun Harrison case. Now, I want to bring in a very special guest with me right now, somebody who is outside the courtroom right now, law enforcement expert Vincent Hill. Vincent, it's great to have you on the program.
Jesse, good morning. How are you, sir?
So, just so I would understand, and our viewers and listeners can understand, you're outside the courtroom right now in the Harrison case?
No, unfortunately, I'm not. I wish I was, but I'm not.
I thought you were.
Via Skype.
Oh, well, then in that case, but you've been following this case pretty much from the beginning. What is your take on it?
Well, you know, it's a tough case to prove for the prosecution. I mean, here, by all intents and purposes, is a guy who people see as a man of God. He has no criminal history. The video that we've all seen of the shooting, the alleged shooting, is very grainy. It doesn't say that it was Shaun Harrison that pulled the trigger in that video. So right now it's a lot of word of mouth and it's a lot of he said, she said. And you have these individuals that many would see as troubled youth testifying against this pastor. So it's a hard case for the prosecution, in my opinion.
Okay, so Vincent, you mentioned a good point. It's he said, he said. One of the interesting things about this case is that Luis Rodriguez, the victim, the boy that was shot in the head or allegedly shot in the head by Mr. Harrison, he survived. And he testified and pointed the finger at Harrison. We're going to play his testimony. We analyzed it, and really, I want our viewers and listeners to carefully look at this. But before we jump into it, do you think he was credible on the stand?
I think he was credible on the stand. I mean, it's not too often that someone that's shot in the head actually survives, so I don't see that there would be any reason for him to lie to say that Shaun Harrison wasn't his shooter, wasn't the guy that tried to kill him. So I think he came off as credible.
Well, I'm going to have to fight you on that a little bit, considering he, under cross-examination, he wasn't entirely clear about why he didn't first come to police about Harrison. Why didn't he first identify Harrison as the shooter? And I'm wondering if that will stick with the jurors when they ultimately have to deliberate. But here's what we're going to do, Vincent. Stand by. We're going to play you now, for anybody who missed it, the really compelling testimony of Luis Rodriguez, the victim, the boy, I should say, who was shot in the head allegedly by Shaun Harrison. So let's understand a little bit more about their relationship. This again, is Luis Rodriguez, the victim in the Shaun Harrison case. That was some of the testimony of the victim in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Welcome back to Law and Crime. That is our main focus right now, the Shaun Harrison case. We are waiting for a live feed in that courtroom. A reverend who is on trial for gun charges, drug charges, as well as attempted murder charges in connection with, as you just heard, the victim himself, Luis Rodriguez, a high school student who claims that he was shot in the back of the head by Shaun Harrison one night in 2015. And why? It's alleged that this young man was one of the drug associates, the drug dealers of Shaun Harrison, who is alleged to have operated this criminal enterprise. And they got into a dispute about decreased drug sales, and Harrison wanted him dead. Let's bring back in law enforcement expert Vincent Hill. Vincent, I don't know if you had an opportunity to hear that, but under cross-examination, how come when he's shot, he gets up, flags down a car, how come the first thing he doesn't say is, Shaun, you have to get Shaun Harrison. He's the person who just did this.
Well, Jesse, this is pure speculation, but in my days in patrol, especially working narcotics, the drug game is a very dangerous game. And there's an old saying on the street that snitches get stitches. I mean, this kid was shot in the back of the head. He says that Shaun Harrison did it, and maybe he was in fear of retaliation. I got out with my life this time. Next time I won't be so lucky. So that's the only speculation that I have on that maybe he was just afraid that if he said something, that Shaun Harrison would come back, or whoever would come back, and finish the job.
And do you take credence to the fact that he just was shot, you know, maybe even the moments after, a day after, 2 days after, he's still recovering from that gunshot wound, and perhaps he's not thinking the best way he should, but at the same time, it's not like he was incapacitated.
Yeah, he wasn't incapacitated. So, you know, again, the only speculation I have is that maybe he was in fear of his life. We don't know why he didn't say anything at that point. But just the fact that he didn't come forward then doesn't necessarily mean that Shaun Harrison wasn't the one involved and shooting him in the back of the head.
And what about the fact that he said, look, I was high, even if I was smoking drugs, it doesn't really matter. It didn't affect my ability to know who shot me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's some credence to that because, I mean, he was only smoking marijuana. He wasn't smoking anything like crack cocaine or methamphetamines or something like that that messes with your psyche in that way, or any hallucinant that may have affected his psyche. So I think there's some credibility to what he says there, that, yes, I was smoking marijuana. However, I knew who I was with at that time. I knew who shot me at that time.
Maybe that's what the jury's ultimately hearing, or maybe they have some reasonable doubt about this. Again, Mr. Rodriguez was one of the first witnesses to testify in this case, so we are seeing the continuation, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the defense does, including will they or won't they put the defendant, Shaun Harrison, on the stand. We'll have to see. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. We are covering the Reverend Shaun Harrison case for you right now, a Boston pastor who's on trial for many different crimes, including the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Harrison was a dean at the English High School in Massachusetts. Rodriguez was a student there, and it is alleged that he enlisted the help of Rodriguez to sell drugs for him, that Mr. Harrison was really leading a double life as a drug kingpin. They got into a dispute about decreased drug sales. Harrison lured him out one night and shot him in the back of the head, execution style. What we're doing for you as we wait for the live feed in that courtroom is we are recapping the testimony of perhaps the most important witness in this whole case, Mr. Rodriguez himself, the victim, the man who says he was shot in the head by Harrison. Well, he survived, and he testified and pointed the finger at Harrison. Well, it was up to the defense to really poke holes in his testimony. And what did they say? First, they were questioning about his drug use at the night in question and whether that affected his ability to remember what happened. And then they also said, why didn't you immediately point the finger at Harrison? Why did it take you some time to say he was the shooter? And that becomes a question for the jury that they're ultimately going to have to consider. This is a continuation of some of his testimony. And this is right when they get into about Mr. Rodriguez being taken to the hospital after being shot. Let's listen in about what happened. You're listening and watching to the testimony of the victim in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and that is the case that we're covering. A Boston pastor who's on trial for drug charges and gun charges, but also charges in connection with the attempted murder of the man you just heard, Luis Rodriguez, a high school student at the time of the shooting. It's alleged that he worked with Mr. Harrison in the drug trade. It's alleged that this Mr. Harrison, this Reverend, the Rev, was actually leading a double life as a drug dealer. And they had a dispute about decreased drug sales, and Harrison wanted him taken out. Well, the question became under cross-examination of this witness who was pointing the finger at Harrison, saying he's the shooter. Why didn't he initially come forward and say that Harrison was the shooter? Why not tell when you go to the hospital? And that becomes the question, and we're talking about this. Let's bring back in law enforcement expert, excuse me, Vincent Hill. Vincent, we talked about it earlier before the break that, okay, maybe you said it perfectly, that maybe in the drug trade, he didn't want to come out first and say, Harrison's the one who shot me. Maybe he was in fear of that. Maybe he didn't even want to admit that he was smoking weed or dealing weed, and maybe he didn't want to do that. But here's the question. This is really up for the jury for credibility, right? So when Mr. Rodriguez keeps saying things, I don't remember, and I don't remember, does he really not remember? Does he really not remember why he didn't tell about Harrison being the shooter, or he really doesn't remember about his involvement in the drug trade, or is he not being entirely truthful on the stand right now?
Yeah, and that's the million-dollar question, right, Jesse? Does he not remember because of the marijuana and because of the trauma to his head at that time? You heard him say he was just getting back to his senses, or does he not remember because, like you said, he doesn't want to get in trouble for selling these drugs or smoking these drugs, which of course is still illegal in Boston to either possess or smoke marijuana.
But we already know that. So why doesn't he just come forward and say, look, exactly what you said, Vincent. If I were to tell his name, I was afraid I was going to get killed. If I was to tell his name, I didn't want to get in trouble with authorities. Why not just, if that's really the case, then come forward. Otherwise, if we take it for his word and he doesn't remember, he was shot in the head. I guess if I'm sitting on the jury, I don't know what to believe.
Yeah, as a juror, I wouldn't know what to believe either. Most jurors that we assume are not involved in the drug trade and we assume do not live a street life would say, well, if someone shot me, I would come forward and tell their name immediately. So, of course, that's playing into the jury's mindset for sure, but, we don't know why this Mr. Rodriguez did not tell it was Shaun Harrison. We can only speculate as to why. But to your point, Jesse, that's going to play heavily on the jurors' minds as far as his credibility on what really happened that night or who really shot him.
Because when a victim testifies, we want to believe everything they say. I don't
Absolutely.
care what you're involved in. If you're shot in the head, I want to know who did it, and I want to know why you weren't entirely forthcoming about it. Now, here's where we're going to get into our next part of the testimony. This is when Luis Rodriguez actually tells the police, for the first time, that Shaun Harrison is the shooter. Take a look. Okay, now that was very interesting testimony of the victim in the Shaun Harrison case. So what you were just listening to was the testimony of Luis Rodriguez, a high school student who claims that he was shot in the head by the defendant one night in 2015. It's alleged that Mr. Rodriguez, the person you were just listening to, was involved in the drug trade with the Reverend Shaun Harrison, that the Reverend was really leading a double life as a drug dealer. And after they had a dispute about decreased drug sales, because Rodriguez was allegedly one of his drug dealers, he got shot in the head by Harrison. But what did we just learn from Mr. Rodriguez in the stand? That he didn't first identify Harrison as the shooter, that he didn't think he was the shooter. He didn't even see the face of him. Let's bring back in law enforcement expert Vincent Hill. Okay, so now that's interesting. It's dark. If you look at the surveillance footage of the shooting, or what appears to be the shooting, the jury's seen it, our viewers have seen it, it's hard to tell who's who. It's hard to tell what's happening. It took place in a dark night in the snow. What did we just hear? He didn't know it was Harrison at first and didn't even think it was Harrison at first. Again, how is that not a reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury?
Well, what really cast doubt is you heard him say, listen, I didn't know it was him until after I talked to my aunt. I mean,
yeah, what does that mean? What does that mean to you?
Right. I mean, does that say that this aunt had some type of vendetta against this Mr. Harrison here? Like, if you were with this guy just before he shot you, you would assume that you would know that, yes, that was the Rev, as he called it, or this was Shaun Harrison. But he says, oh, I didn't know it was him, or I didn't identify him until after I talked to my aunt. That begs the question, does she have something against Mr. Harrison that she wanted to get him in trouble for? I mean, here's the deal, Jesse. Listen, I've worked narcotics, and the fact that Shaun Harrison had no previous criminal history, to me, is suspect, because Boston police, which I assume they do, have a narcotics unit. They're investigating narcotics. So I'm sure his name would have come up at some point. So that really, really casts doubt as to the credibility of Mr. Rodriguez's testimony there.
Then again, this could be like Breaking Bad. He hit a double life for who knows how long. And how did he even enter into the school system? He's been accused of selling drugs on the school property. His guns, ammunition, drugs were found at his apartment. There's been people who said they've smoked with him, they've seen him deal drugs. One person says something, but a lot of people come forward. You start to believe it a little bit more. The question for them is, and we talk about this, can't you separate this case into two things? Maybe he's guilty of drug charges. Maybe even he's guilty of gun possession. But does that make him guilty of attempted murder? Now, all of our listeners on SiriusXM Radio, you can't see the video. I hope you come back, go to lawandcrime.com. You can actually see the video. What appears to be the shooting. It's very hard to tell what's happening. You see two figures dressed in dark clothing walking in the snow, one with an outstretched hand. It appears that one of them falls to the ground, the other one runs away. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to tell. And if the victim himself said when he originally was shot, he doesn't know that Harrison was the shooter, and then only after speaking with a family member that he comes forward, you could imagine, Vincent, right, that it's, hey, let's point the finger at somebody else. Who can we point the finger at? Oh, I know, Mr. Harrison has drugs in his apartment. I saw him dealing drugs in the school. He's probably the shooter. I mean, again, it could be very well true, but just having the eyewitness himself, the victim himself saying it without corroborating testimony, I'm a little hesitant.
Yeah, it could be true, or it could be, to your point, Jesse, that he's the fall guy for someone else. Again, the drug trade is a very cutthroat business. So maybe there's someone bigger and badder than this this pastor, this Shaun Harrison, that Mr. Rodriguez was in fear of, and maybe that's why he went back and talked to his aunt and later said, "Oh, well, it was the Rev that shot me." Could be something else that we don't know about at this time.
You make a really good point. We just don't know. That's a very good point. Who knows who's at the top of the chain? And that's what we're trying to figure out here on Law and Crime. What really happened that night? We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we have a lot more to analyze here in the Shaun Harrison case.